Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we are checking out the most extreme, most ridiculous graphics card I've ever seen. And I've got to say, I'm not entirely sure how I feel about it. So let's carry on with the review and I'll do my best to work this thing out by the end. And by this thing, I mean the new Gigabyte Aorus RTX 3080 Xtreme. It is quite the whopper. But before we take a closer look, a word from today's video sponsor.
IPS is renowned for producing some of the best colours available for gaming monitors, but it's always come at a trade-off. MSI has taken their engineering to a whole new level with the introduction of a revolutionary rapid IPS panel that's backed with quantum dot technology. For the first time ever, the new MSI Optics MAG274QRF-QD gives you game-changing speed with unprecedented colour accuracy that outclasses the best of the best that we've tested here on the channel. Revel in rich, deep, incredible colour and push your gaming to its limits with 1 millisecond grade-to-grade response times and ultra-fast 165Hz refresh rates. If a gaming monitor could be described as coming close to perfect, this would be it. So learn more about MSI's new Optics MAG274QRF-QD monitor via the links below.
So yeah, it's a 4-slot graphics card. And you heard that right, 4 slots. And that means it measures 70mm wide, making it about 30% wider than a typical high-end graphics card. It also measures 319mm long, 140mm tall, and as a result of those massive dimensions, it weighs in at 1,894 grams. Though I've got to admit that's not nearly as much as I was expecting, and this is because I have the Asus RTX 3080 ROG Strix Gaming, which also measures 140mm tall and 319mm long, but it's just 59mm wide, giving the Gigabyte Aorus model a 21% greater volume, and yet it weighs just 8% more. In terms of design, I'd say the Aorus Xtreme is best described as a slab. It's a real slab of a graphics card, and this is really how it appears from almost all angles. Front on though, you don't get quite the same sense of how substantial it is, though the cooling setup still looks very impressive. Embedded in the plastic fan shroud are two 115mm fans and a single 100mm fan. The left fan is the 100mm model, with the center and right fans being 115mm in diameter. It is worth noting the fact that the outer fans spin counterclockwise while the centrally located fan spins in a clockwise direction. Also, in order to fit these large fans, Gigabyte has had to overlap them, and this helps to maximize coverage, leaving virtually no airflow dead zones. Along with the fans, there are a number of RGB lit zones which can be customized using Gigabyte's RGB Fusion 2.0 software. The RGB lighting extends to the rear and side of the card as well. On the outer facing edge, Gigabyte has included a small LCD panel which can be used to display graphics card information, as well as custom text, pictures, and GIFs. Again, all controllable via the RGB Fusion 2.0 software. Also found on the outer facing edge of the card are 3 8-pin PCIe power connectors, and this card absolutely calls for that much power input, as we'll explore a little later in the review. Before we move on to the back side of the card though, I'd just like to note that the fan shroud extends around both sides, directing airflow through the fin stack, and Gigabyte has even boxed in the end of the card for a bit of a neat looking finish. It is a bit of a boxy look, but overall I think it is very neat. Then around on the back side of the card is a full-length aluminium backplate, which is quite thick and does a good job of supporting the PCB. Again, there is a little bit of RGB lighting here, and then towards the end of the card, Gigabyte has also included a small cutout, which should help improve airflow. Finally, around the I/O bracket, we find half a dozen display outputs, which include 2 HDMI 2.1 ports, 1 HDMI 2.1 port, and 3 DisplayPort 1.4a outputs. That said, it is worth noting that only 4 of these outputs can be used simultaneously. Something I found quite disappointing here was the fact that Gigabyte's opted to use a dual-slot I/O bracket and not a 3-slot bracket like what we saw with Nvidia's FE model. Hell, a 4-slot bracket could probably be called for here. The advantage of the larger bracket is that it can give the card a lot more support, and the 3-slot version used by Nvidia works incredibly well, so I feel this is something Gigabyte shouldn't have overlooked. Okay, so time to tear the Aorus RTX 3080 Xtreme down for a closer look at that massive cooler and what's no doubt going to be an extreme PCB. Starting with the cooler, we have 1,398 grams of mostly aluminium and copper. The base of the heatsink features a large vapor chamber riddled with copper pipes. There's 8 in total, 4 fed into the left bank of fins with another 4 transferring heat to the right bank. The copper base makes direct contact with the GPU die, and the aluminium spacer has been used to make contact with the GDDR6X memory. Gigabyte's also used aluminium spacers in order to cool the VRM components, including both the power stages and inductors. Then we have the 139 gram backplate, which features a few thermal pads, and these are designed to remove built-up heat from the rear side of the PCB. And rather than trap that heat between the backplate and PCB, the thermal pads help turn the backplate into a heat spreader, which is what we like to see. Then finally, over on the PCB, we find a fairly compact 270mm long PCB equipped with 20 alpha and omega 50A power stages, so not nearly as good as the VRM found on the Asus Strix model. What we have here is a 16-phase VRM for the GPU, and then a 4-phase VRM for the GDDR6X memory. As for power input, Gigabyte has gone with a trio of 8-pin PCIe power connectors, but unlike MSI's Gaming X Trio, where the third connector was completely unnecessary, the Aorus Xtreme actually calls for a third PCIe 8-pin connector, as Gigabyte has increased the manual power limit right up to 450 watts. So significantly higher than that of the Gaming X Trio, which was limited to just 340 watts, so just 20 watts over the reference spec. Just lastly, Gigabyte has also included a dual BIOS switch that allows you to change from the default performance BIOS to a quiet BIOS. The performance BIOS runs the card at 370 watts by default, while the quiet BIOS runs at 20 watts lower at 350 watts. So it is more than just a fan curve, which we really do like to see when offering a secondary BIOS. Now, in terms of clock specifications, Gigabyte lists a core clock frequency of 1905 MHz, which is an 11% boost over the 1710 MHz default spec. The GDDR6X memory, on the other hand, that has been left stock at 19 gigabits per second, but still, for the cores, that is a decent factory overclock, and I believe the most aggressive factory overclock that we've seen so far for an RTX 3080. Playing Shadow of the Tomb Raider for 30 minutes saw the Aorus Xtreme peak at 68 degrees in a 21 degree room inside the Corsair Obsidian 500D, fully populated with fans. That's not really an amazing result, to be honest, and I'll compare it to some of the other RTX 3080 graphics cards that we've already tested in a moment. In order to maintain this temperature, the fan spun at up to 2300 RPM, and that is quite a high fan speed, and as a result the card was quite noisy, 43 decibels. Now, the typical core clock speed seen during our testing was 1965 MHz, and that saw the power consumption for the graphics card hit 383 watts, so an almost 20% increase over the FE model. Now, for overclocking with the limits reached, we again saw a peak operating temperature of just 70 degrees, but this time the fan spun at up to 2700 RPM. It was very loud at this fan speed and could easily be heard over the case fans. Still, the overclock did see the cores operate at 2055 MHz on average, and the memory also hit 21.1 gigabits per second, so an incredibly impressive transfer speed there. Finally, when overclocked, the card sucked down 402 watts, so just a 5% increase from the stock factory OC configuration. Finally, here's a look at how the Aorus Xtreme behaves using the silent 350 watt BIOS, and here we are seeing a dramatic reduction in fan speed down to 1950 RPM, which did drop the operating volume down to 37 decibels. So the card was very quiet here. That said, it did run 3 degrees hotter, peaking at 71 degrees, and the typical core clock frequency was reduced by 4% down to 1890 MHz. Okay, so let's move into the benchmark graphs. Please note for this one I am using the AMD Ryzen 9 3950X, as I haven't updated these results to the 5950X yet, but there is very little difference at 1440p and 4K. The test system is also configured with 32GB of DDR4 3200CL14 memory. The latest drivers available at the time of testing have been used, and for this one we have just a few select benchmarks to look at. As usual with these custom AIB card reviews, we're not going to look at loads of gaming benchmarks. In fact, Shadow of the Tomb Raider will do it. If you are after lots of benchmarks, then please do watch our day one review, but here the focus is on thermals, power, and overclocking. Starting with the 1440p data in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, we see that out of the box, the Aorus Xtreme is similar to my manual overclocks for the Asus TUF Gaming, Gigabyte Gaming OC, and MSI Gaming X Trio, though I should note that that only makes it around 3% faster than those models. In fact, using the quiet BIOS does drop performance by 3% down to the same level as the Gaming OC. Then we see with a little extra tinkering, I was able to extract a further 5% performance, pushing the average frame rate up to 172 FPS. So not exactly an amazing increase, but that's about as good as overclocking gets with these Ampere GPUs. Jumping up to the 4K resolution, we see much the same really. Again, out of the box, the Aorus Xtreme is very similar to the manually overclocked results achieved by the TUF Gaming, Gaming X Trio, and Gaming OC. That said, I was only able to boost performance by a further 4%, so not exactly super exciting. Now, when looking at power consumption, it is hard to say if that extra 4 to 5% I was able to juice from this thing makes it worth it over the more standard factory OC models. For example, when compared to the gaming OC version, it uses 8% more power out of the box and almost 20% more than the FE model. And of course, helping it manually overclock beyond models such as Gigabyte's own gaming OC is the increased voltage, and while that did allow for an extra 4 to 5% performance as we just saw, it also increased power usage by a further 12%. That said, you can switch to the silent BIOS, which saw power consumption for the Aorus Xtreme just 2% higher than that of the gaming OC. That extra power draw doesn't exactly help out when it comes to cooling. Despite the massive heatsink, the Aorus Xtreme is still a pretty hot graphics card, at least relative to the smaller triple slot models, and it often makes a little bit more noise as well. Stock the GPU die temperature does look good, but remember the fans are spinning at 2300 RPM and generating 43 decibels of noise. So if we normalize to 40 decibels, the Aorus Xtreme looks pretty poor when compared to the more standard factory OC models like the Gaming X Trio, Gaming OC and Tough Gaming. Quite shockingly, it's only running 6 degrees cooler than the dual slot FE model, which is a pretty disappointing result, but then it is also sucking down around 20% more power. The quiet BIOS, which drops power usage by roughly 20 watts, does dramatically reduce the operating temperature, at least once we account for the operating volume. With the stock fan speeds from the quiet profile, it actually ran 3 degrees hotter, but once we normalized it, it was 7 degrees cooler, though that is still 2 degrees hotter than the gaming OC. Still, I should note the Aorus Xtreme is still sucking down around 10 watts more than the gaming OC, so accounting for that, it should run a little bit cooler when noise and power normalized. Though for such a massive graphics card, I'd still say that's a bit disappointing. Out of the box, the GDDR6X temperatures aren't bad, peaking at 72 degrees, but again, once we noise normalize, it is running quite a bit hotter than the Tough Gaming, Gaming X Trio and Gaming OC models, so again, not a particularly great result. The VRM temperatures are pretty similar to what we saw with the GDDR6X memory. With the fan spinning at 2300 RPM, temperatures are only slightly higher than the Gaming X Trio and Gaming OC. However, once we noise normalize, the Aorus Xtreme is only able to just beat the Founders Edition, which really isn't a good result as that is just a dual slot card. Well, I've got to admit, I am coming away from this one with mixed feelings. The Gigabyte Aorus RTX 3080 Xtreme is such an epic looking graphics card, and really it should wipe the floor with all other air-cooled graphics cards, with perhaps the only exception being the equally massive MSI Supreme version, and we'll be looking at that shortly. The main issue being with a product like the Aorus Xtreme is that there really isn't any OC headroom left in these Ampere GPUs. In many ways, parts like the RTX 3080 are by default already pushed well beyond their efficiency window. And keep in mind, a stock 3080 has a 380 watt TDP. So while this product will still appeal to overclocking nuts who salivate an extra point or two in 3D Mark, for everyone else this is just a truly massive graphics card that in many ways underdelivers. Sounds a little bit harsh, but you'd probably expect a 4-slot graphics card that's bigger than some mini ITX builds to blow away the more normal high-end products, like Gigabyte's own Gaming OC for example, but as you just saw, it kind of fails to do that. This is because in order to get that extra 2 to 3%, Gigabyte's pushing well into the territory of diminishing returns, sucking up loads more power for very little in the way of extra FPS. Of course, that is the idea of the product, so in that sense, it does what it's intended to. But in my opinion, the silent BIOS is a little more manageable, and frankly for general use, aka playing games, this seems like a more practical configuration to me. You also get 96% of the original performance, but a much quieter graphics card, or if you maintain the original noise level, a much cooler graphics card. I also wonder how many OC nuts are that keen to get their hands on a big bulky air-cooled graphics card. While I'm not that interested in overclocking myself these days, as for me much of the magic was lost years ago, I would have thought the RTX 3080 Xtreme Waterforce would be a much more desirable product for mad overclockers. But in any case, I really can't knock Gigabyte for offering multiple options, and after all, the Aorus RTX 3080 Xtreme is a well-made graphics card, but it's probably just not for me, especially given the price tag. Speaking of which, the RTX 3080 Aorus Xtreme is currently listed at $930 US. Of course, there is no stock, and getting one in the foreseeable future will be nearly impossible, but this review serves as a guide to help you know what to be on the lookout for. The Aorus Master version is slightly cheaper at $900 US, and then we have the Gaming OC at $840, while the base model Gigabyte Eagle is currently listed at $770 US, and that's about as close as you're likely going to get to the MSRP. That said, places such as Newegg.com do have $700 US RTX 3080 models listed. Whether or not they'll ever be in stock again is impossible to say at this point in time. Anyway, the Gigabyte Aorus RTX 3080 Xtreme is a massive air-cooled graphics card designed for overclockers looking to get every last bit out of their graphics card. The build quality is excellent. There's really no design flaws to speak of, as it does everything that it's designed to do. And that is going to do it for this one. If you like the video, you know what to do. You can subscribe for more content. We have a few more GeForce RTX card reviews coming up over the next few weeks. I'll get to them slowly in the hope that availability improves, but yeah, it's been a while now, hasn't it? Anyway, enough of that. If you'd like to become a Hardware Unboxed community member, you can join us over on Floatplane or Patreon. The links for those are in the video description. We'll get you access to monthly live streams where Tim and myself chat with you guys about whatever you want us to chat about. We have a Discord chat where, again, you can chat with the whole Hardware Unboxed community there. Tim and I are active there daily. Q&A stuff, behind the scenes videos. If you're interested, links for that stuff is in the video description. If not, perfectly fine. And I would like to just thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve, and I'll see you again next time.